Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling an amazing piece of natural architecture, the human orbit, and all the machinery that comes with it, the accessory visual apparatus.
Yeah.
Our mission is pure anatomy, pulled straight from a classic text. We're going through a chapter that outlines, the eye's house, its support systems, and all of its complex wiring.
That's a blueprint.
It is, and we know these chapters can feel a bit like trying to read blueprints in the dark. So our goal is to turn those diagrams and dense spatial relationships into a mental map that you can actually follow.
And the key thing to grasp right from the start is that the orbit isn't just a socket. It's a very specialized skeletal cavity. It has to be to maintain the perfect alignment for binocular vision.
And it anchors everything.
It anchors the 6 extraocular muscles, and it funnels all the nerves and blood vessels into this tiny, tiny space at the back.
Here's a fact that really sets the stage for me. If you picture the orbit as this sort of four-sided pyramid, the eyeball itself only takes up about a fifth of that space.
Just 1/5, that's it.
So what's in the rest of it?
The other 4/5 is just packed. It's full of protective orbital fat, connective tissue, 7 muscles, and all the wiring and plumbing we're about to get into, everything has to fit just so.
Okay, so let's unpack that bony pyramid. We're visualizing the opening on the face as the base, and then the walls narrow as they go back.
Exactly. They narrow to an apex that points posteromedially back and towards the middle of your head.
And the walls themselves tell a story.
They really do. Let's start at the top with the roof. It's mostly the orbital plate of the frontal bone, and its job is to separate the orbit from the brain.
From the anterior cranial fossa, to be specific.
That's right. And on that roof, you've got 2 little landmarks to look for. One is the trochlear fovea, a tiny dip where the pulley for the superior oblique muscle sits.
We'll definitely come back to that, Polly.
And the other is the lacrimal fossa, which is just a shallow depression where the lacrimal gland is cradled.
Okay, roof done. Now, the medial wall. This is where things get dicey.
Yes. Clinically, this is a critical spot. The medial wall is stunningly thin. It's often called the lamina papyracea of the ethmoid bone.
Wait, lamina papyracea. What did that translate to?
It means papery plate.
Papery. That sounds fragile.
It is incredibly fragile, and it's right next to the ethmoidal air cells, part of your sinuses.
So I'm guessing that's a problem.
A huge one. It's why an ethmoidal sinusitis can become so dangerous. The infection can just eat right through that papery bone and spread into the orbit. Orbital cellulitis. A true emergency.
Wow. Okay, so the medial wall is thin. What about the floor?
Also quite delicate. It's mostly the orbital plate of the maxilla, and it's also the roof of the maxillary sinus, which sits right below it. And this is where we see the classic.
The blowout fracture.
The blowout fracture. A direct blow to the eye, like from a fist or a squash ball. The pressure spikes, the tough bony rim holds, but the thin floor just gives way.
And what happens to the contents of the orbit?
Well, they can get pushed down into the maxillary sinus. 2 big problems there. First, you can entrap soft tissue, maybe even the inferior rectus muscle.
And if that muscle gets stuck?
You can't look up properly. You get double vision, what we call diplopia. And second, the infraorbital nerve runs in a little groove on that floor. If it gets damaged, you get numbness across your cheek and upper lip.
So we have 2 delicate walls. That leaves the lateral wall.
The lateral wall is the bodyguard. It's the thickest, most robust part, made of the zygomatic bone and the sphenoid. It's what protects the eye from the side.
Okay, we have the box. Now we need the doors and windows, the apertures.
The highways in and out. First up is the optic canal. It's a dedicated tunnel in the sphenoid bone for the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, and the main blood supply, the ophthalmic artery.
Just those 2?
Just those 2. Very important real estate. Then you have the superior orbital fissure. It's a big, jagged gap.
And it sounds like it's the grand central station of the orbit.
It really is. It is so crowded. You have all 3 motor nerves for the eye muscles passing through. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6.
Okay.
You also have the ophthalmic veins for drainage. And all 3 big sensory branches of the ophthalmic nerve, the lacrimal, frontal, and esociliary, all stacked in that one fissure.
So a single problem in that one spot, some
Yep.
swelling, a tumor, it could knock out movement, sensation, and venous drainage all at once.
Instantly. It's a huge bottleneck. And then below that, you have the inferior orbital fissure, which is mainly for some sensory nerves from the maxillary division, V2.
All right, so we've built the house. Now let's talk about the furniture, the stuff inside that keeps everything stable. It's not just loose fat, is it?
Not at all. It's a highly organized system. Right at the front, you've got the orbital septum. It's a weak membrane, but it's the great clinical divider.
Divider between what?
Between an infection in front of it, which is pre-septal cellulitis, not great, but manageable, And an infection behind it, that's post-septal or orbital cellulitis. Far, far more dangerous.
Got it. And deeper in.
Deeper in, wrapped around the eyeball itself, is the fascial sheath of the eyeball,
Hmm?
or Tennant's capsule. Think of it like a lubricated socket inside the main bony socket. It lets the eye move around smoothly.
The text also mentioned a hammock.
Yes. The suspensory ligament of the eye, or Lockwood's ligament. It's this thickened band of fascia from the lower muscles, slung underneath the globe. It's so strong it can hold the eye in place even if you lose the entire orbital floor in a fracture.
That's incredible. And there's this newer idea, the active pulley hypothesis. What's that about?
It's a really cool concept. The old view was that muscles just pulled on a fixed point. This hypothesis suggests that the connective tissue sheaths around the muscles act like dynamic elastic pulleys.
So they're not just passive tunnels.
Exactly. They actively shift to keep the muscle's line of pull stable and efficient no matter where the eye is pointing. It's crucial for the incredible speed and accuracy of eye movements.
Which brings us to the muscles themselves. All four of the rectus muscles start from one spot, right?
Yeah.
The common tendinous ring.
That's the keystone. It's a fibrous ring right at the apex circling the optic canal. It's the anchor point for the four recti.
Okay, let's run through them.
First, not a mover of the eye, but the levator palpebrae superioris, or LPS. It elevates the upper eyelid. It's mostly innervated by cranial nerve 3, but it has a small, smooth muscle part.
The inferior tarsal muscle.
Right, and that part gets sympathetic innervation. If you lose that, you get the slight eyelid droop, the mild flutosis you see in Horner syndrome.
Okay, now the eye movers.
The medial rectus is the strongest. It's for pure adduction, moving the eye in. Cranial nerve 3, the lateral rectus does the opposite, pure abduction, moving the eye out. And it's all alone with its own nerve.
Cranial nerve 6, the abducens, which makes an isolated sixth nerve palsy a huge diagnostic clue, right?
Critical clue. It points you right to a problem along that nerve's path because nothing else can abduct the eye.
And the superior and inferior recti are more complicated.
They are. They don't pull straight. They pull at about a 25-degree angle away from the eye's main axis. So the superior rectus elevates, yes, but it also pulls the eye in a bit. It adducts. The inferior rectus depresses and also adducts.
So to get pure up and down movement, you have to use the oblique muscles to cancel out that rotation.
You've got it. That's where the obliques come in. The superior oblique is the famous one that loops through that pulley, the trochlea. It's run by cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve. Its job is depression, abduction, and intorsion inward rotation.
And the inferior oblique.
It's the only one that doesn't start at the apex. It comes from the floor. It does the opposite. Elevation, abduction, and extorsion or outward rotation. It's this beautiful, complex dance.
Okay, let's switch to the plumbing and wiring. The ophthalmic artery is the big one.
It's the main supply line, branching off the internal carotid and coming in right through the optic canal with the optic nerve.
What are the must-know branches from that artery?
The very first one you have to know is the tiny central retinal artery. It's an end artery, the sole supply to the inner retina. If that gets blocked, it's sudden, painless, catastrophic vision loss.
A true emergency.
Absolutely. Then you have other key branches like the ciliary arteries and the lacrimal artery. The lacrimal is interesting because it makes connections with arteries on the outside, linking the internal and external carotid systems.
And what about getting blood out? The veins.
Right. The superior and inferior ophthalmic veins are the main drainage pipes. And here's the kicker. They have no valves.
No valves, so blood can flow both ways.
Both ways. And they drain back into the cavernous sinus, which is inside the skull. This is the danger triangle of the face connection. An infection on your face can, in rare cases, travel backward through these valveless veins directly into the cavernous sinus.
Causing a septic thrombosis, a nightmare scenario.
Exactly.
Okay, let's wrap up with the nerves, specifically the big one, cranial nerve 3.
The oculomotor nerve. It runs most of the muscles. But here is the critical clinical detail you have to remember. The parasympathetic fibers, the ones that constrict your pupil, they run on the outside surface of the nerve.
So they're vulnerable to anything pushing on the nerve from the outside.
Precisely, like an aneurysm of the posterior communicating artery. So if a patient has a down and out eye from the muscle palsy and a big dilated pupil, you have to suspect compression, an emergency.
But there's the opposite situation, the pupil-sparing palsy.
Correct. The motor fibers deep inside the nerve get their blood from tiny vessels that can be damaged by things like diabetes or high blood pressure. So if the problem is ischemic, a lack of blood flow, it hits the center of the nerve, but it can spare those superficial pupillary fibers.
So if the eye is still down and out, but the pupil reacts normally.
And that points you towards a microvascular cause, not a compressive aneurysm. It's a massive diagnostic clue.
And the other motor nerves.
Just quickly, CNIV, the trochlear, enters the orbit outside the common tendinous ring we mentioned. But CNGI, the abducens, enters inside the ring. That geography matters when you're trying to localize a lesion.
And what about that little relay station, the ciliary ganglion?
It's a tiny parasympathetic hub. Fibers from CN3 stop there, they synapse, and then new fibers go on to constrict the pupil and control focus. But the sympathetic fibers, the ones that dilate the pupil, they just pass straight through it without stopping. It's a one-way street for them.
Okay, we've built the house, moved the eye, and wired it up. Let's finish with the accessories that protect the surface. The eyelids.
The eyelids are our primary shields. They protect, but they also have to spread the tear film evenly with every blink. Their structure comes from the tarsal plates, these dense, fibrous sheets, and embedded inside them are the meibomian glands.
And those glands make oil.
They make a lipid-rich oil called meibum. It's the top layer of the tear film, and it's absolutely essential. It stops the watery part of the tears from just evaporating away. Without it, you get severe dry eye.
And lining the whole system is the conjunctiva.
Right, a thin, transparent mucous membrane that forms a protective sac. And its goblet cells make the mucin layer of the tears, the sticky part that helps the tears adhere to the eye's surface.
So we've got the oil layer from the meibomian glands, the mucin layer from the conjunctiva, and the water layer comes from the lacrimal gland.
That's the one. The lacrimal gland makes the bulk aqueous fluid full of protective proteins like lysozyme. It's divided into two parts, an orbital and a palpebral part.
And there's a surgical trick with those two parts.
There is. All the ducts from the main orbital part have to pass through the smaller palpebral part. So if you need to stop tear production, a surgeon can just remove that smaller palpebral section, and it effectively shuts down the whole gland.
And once the tears are on the eye, how do they get out? The drainage system.
They collect medially near the nose and go into these tiny holes called the puncta. From there, they travel through little tubes, the canaliculi, into the lacrimal sac. Then it's a straight shot down the nasolacrimal duct, about 18 millimeters long, into your nose.
Which is why your nose runs when you cry.
That's exactly why. And it's not gravity doing the work, it's the pumping action of your eyelid muscles when you blink. That's what drives the whole system.
What a deep dive. You've gone from the thickest wall to the thinnest, from the big picture to the microscopic wiring.
And if you want to tie it all together, think about something called orbital apex syndrome. A single lesion right at that crowded apex can knock out the optic nerve, all the motor nerves, the sensory nerves, everything. It causes vision loss and total paralysis of the eye. It's the perfect example of how this tight anatomy dictates the clinical picture.
That density is just stunning. Okay, here's a final thought for you to consider. We talked about eye movements. Saccades, those rapid shifts of gaze, can reach speeds of 500 degrees per second, just lightning fast.
Incredible speed.
So if you think about all the complex wiring we just discussed, what does that immediate, almost instantaneous speed tell us about the efficiency of the brainstem's motor command centers? Specifically, the paramedian pontine reticular formation, the PPRF. That center is firing off commands faster than your conscious brain can even decide to look somewhere else.
A true marvel of neuroanatomical efficiency. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of the human orbit.